Hi everybody, back with another video. Today in celebration of Black History Month, I want to talk about the Black Angels. These were the nurses at Seaview Hospital in Staten Island, New York in the early 20th century. They were on the front lines of the first human trials of the first drug to treat tuberculosis. It was called isoniazid. And their work in clinical research and in patient care led to treatments that became 95% effective in curing tuberculosis. And their contributions are documented in the book, The Black Angels, The Untold Story of the Nurses Who Helped Cure Tuberculosis. This is a book by Maria Smilios. And this was during the time of segregation. White nurses at Seaview Hospital saw the severity of tuberculosis and how easy it was to catch, so they quit their jobs. They saw the dangers, and they knew they could get much less dangerous work as secretaries or store clerks or in bakeries and the like. So they left their jobs as nurses. And now, on top of this being a serious medical crisis, it also became a personnel crisis for the Seaview Hospital. And administrators had to scramble to figure out what to do. How are they going to get nurses to come and work in such a dangerous facility? So they recruited Black nurses from the South whose amazing work led to compassionate care for patients who were languishing and isolated with tuberculosis, as well as the medications that would ultimately become 95% effective at curing tuberculosis. Now, the author was doing research for a publication on a different matter when she came across a line in a book about these nurses, and her research into them, who these nurses were, where they came from, and everything she could find out about them led to her book, and it basically brought these women and their contributions to medical science out of obscurity, and I think that's a wonderful thing. So hey, listen to this. This is from nurse.org. The Untold Stories of 7 Black Angels, Nurses Who Helped Cure Tuberculosis. In early 1929, white nurses at Seaview Hospital in Staten Island began hanging up their uniforms and walking out. Their reasons for leaving varied. Some cited the grueling 5-hour round-trip commute from Manhattan to Staten Island. Others said it was the mental and physical toll the job demanded. Most white nurses were leaving to escape tuberculosis, the great white plague that was killing their colleagues at Seaview, a sprawling municipal sanatorium known as the Pest House, filled with New York's poorest, people the city considered expendable, uncouth, immoral, indigent, consumptives. That's who was sent to Seaview. Woefully understaffed and underfunded, the hospital was perched high on an isolated hilltop miles away from the ferry port and the vibrancy of city life. Inside its wards, thousands of patients, mostly immigrants, Black people, and those on the fringes of society lay languishing, waiting to die. Stigmatized and ostracized from their communities, many stayed for months or years, their only contact being the white nurses who cared for them. But now they were leaving and miring the city in a crisis. If health officials couldn't staff the ailing Seaview, they would be forced to close wards, and hordes of sick and infected patients would converge on the streets, spreading disease, raising the death toll, and creating a public health catastrophe. Emergency meetings ensued about who would replace Seaview nurses. Then an idea emerged: Black nurses. In almost 2 decades, the Great Migration had brought thousands of Southern workers north to work in factories and steel mills and as cooks or domestics. Nursing wasn't the same kind of labor, but the lines of segregation had left enough Black nurses unemployed in 1929, and there were only 260 Black hospitals versus 6,000 white ones. To ensure they came, the city would offer a package: a job in one of its 4 integrated hospitals. At the time, only 4 of the 29 municipal hospitals hired Black nurses. Steady pay, housing, free education if needed at Harlem Hospital, and most of all, an escape from the strictures of the South. The call went out and moved down the eastern seaboard, crossing the Mason-Dixon line into Virginia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Georgia. Soon, the Black nurses began arriving. For decades, they worked at Seaview, enduring racism, sexism, verbal redlining, and physical abuse from patients. They were also ostracized by Staten Island residents who sneered and shunned them on public transportation. And most of all, they worked day after day onwards with a deadly disease that had no cure. Then in 1952, they became part of the isoniazid drug trials and, in a galvanizing moment in time, helped change the course of global history. Dr. Robitzek said, had it not been for the Black nurses, none of this would have been possible. And until the publication of the Black Angels book, these women had been completely erased from history. From 1929 to 1961, when Seaview finally closed, hundreds heeded the call to work. These nurses were known as the Black Angels, and while every single one of them deserves their story to be told, here's a glimpse into 7 of their stories. 1. Edna Sutton. In 1929, Edna Sutton arrived at Seaview from Savannah, Georgia, where she was born into abject poverty. The oldest of 6, she was a natural caretaker and a brilliant student who loved literature, Latin, drama, and science, especially biology. Her first dream was to become a surgeon, but many said it was unrealistic, as Black women rarely left Savannah, let alone became surgeons. Her father, an enslaved man who walked off his plantation and reinvented himself as a preacher, inspired his oldest daughter to dream big, something she took to heart. While her dreams of becoming a surgeon never materialized, she eventually found her way into an operating room. Seaview hired her as one of the few surgical nurses, a highly sought after and demanding job. In the early 1930s, surgery after the rescue surgery was the gold standard for treating tuberculosis, and the nurses tasked to work on the surgical ward were regarded as the best. Edna spent over 2 decades working at Seaview, enduring a wrath of white supervisors who refused to allow the nurses to wear masks. They would be complacent, she believed. She worked during the dark pre-antibiotic days, assisting in brutal operations when ribs were removed in bushels, 6 to 8 at a time, and chest cavities were stuffed with wax packs or ping pong balls to keep the lungs collapsed. Edna pushed back against the redlining rampant in Staten Island by becoming one of the first Black nurses to buy a house on Bradley Avenue, an area the city had designated as definitely declining because of the influx of Negro population. Despite the categorization, Edna's home became a cornerstone for what soon materialized into a new middle-class Black neighborhood, one heavily populated by professional nurses. 2. Missouria Lavinia Meadows Walker. Missouria came to Seaview by way of Howard University, where she studied under Estelle Massey Osborne and Mary McLeod Bethune. After graduating, she worked closely with Dr. Charles R. Drew, originally from Clinton, South Carolina. She was the 8th of 12 children raised by her mother, Mama Amy, who taught her daughter to read the stars, love stories, be fearless, value education, history, and herself. Growing up, she worked in the cotton fields before school and on the weekends. She was a stellar student who loved history, literature, jazz, and medicine. Her nephew said Missouria dreamed of becoming a nurse, changing the world, and seeing equality for all Black people. At Seaview, Missouria worked on the men's ward, often a dangerous place as the men tended toward violence. One nurse likened it to a bawdy bar at night. In her time there, she tolerated a daily barrage of racially charged verbal abuse, and for a year, she was relegated to care for a Nazi POW, a gravely ill, rage-filled man who wanted to kill her by infecting her with TB. Despite all this, Missouria prevailed. This was her calling, her niece said, and she stayed the course and believed God would help her work it out. In the mid-1940s, she was finally promoted to supervisor for the ward, and in 1952 was chosen to oversee the isoniazid trials. While at Seaview, she was a fierce and devoted advocate for nurses' rights, and she established a fund for nurses in her church, St. Philip's Baptist Church. Unable to have children, she opened her home to anyone who needed a place to stay and raised many of her nieces and nephews, teaching them about their history. Missouria believed that only by knowing the past could anyone move forward. When she retired, she continued her professional duty by caring for people in her neighborhood, and in some cases, she bought beds to care for the sickest in her home. 3. Clemmy Phillips. Clemmy was born in 1904 in Bainbridge, Georgia, a rural and bucolic town that sat in the middle of three rivers, Flint, Chattahoochee, and Apalachicola, and was rife with Native American lore. Growing up, Clemmy's family was beset by poverty. She lived in a three-room shotgun house with no electricity and a single mother who was a laundress. Beset by anxiety and grief, her husband, a preacher, died from TB when Clemmy was 2. She struggled to raise her children and reconcile that 4 older sons abandoned the family to find work, but, as her granddaughter said, fell in with bad people. The burden to help fell on Clemmy, and from the age of 5, she began washing and folding clothes throughout her school years. On Fridays, her mother would keep her home to work. Despite the weekly disruption, Clemmy excelled at school and eventually moved to Savannah to attend Georgia Infirmary, a down-and-out charity hospital that worked on a barter system. Students received free training in exchange for working on the wards. In her second year, she had a daughter, but the father left, leaving her to raise the baby alone. Like her mother, she struggled financially. Then Seaview presented itself. Knowing this was the only way forward, Clemmy was forced to leave her baby in Savannah with, as her granddaughter described, a very cruel and militant sister. At Seaview, she worked hard, and her outstanding work ethic impressed a nearly unimpressible white supervisor who promoted her to a charge nurse within 2 years, enabling Clemmy to bring her daughter north. 4. Phyllis Alfreda Hall Lambert. Phyllis was born in 1909 in the rural town of Alachua, Florida. In 1905, it had a population of 526 residents. It was a hub for the cotton industry that helped to expand the town. Phyllis came from a large family that struggled with poverty. Her grandfather was a Methodist minister, and at some point, according to her family, she was sent to the Baldwin School for Colored Girls. After she graduated, she enrolled in the George E. Brewster School of Nursing Training in Jacksonville, Florida. In 1940, she was recruited to Seaview, where she worked for almost 40 years. She owned a home on Bradley Avenue, and her family described her as outgoing and friendly, a mostly happy and caring person who loved her job. 5. Marjorie Tucker Reed. Marjorie was born in Norfolk, Virginia in 1925 and came to Staten Island when she was 10. In 1946, she began working as an aide at Seaview because she said, "I needed a job." Of the many things Marjorie told me in our interviews, she vividly recalled riding the 111 bus from the Staten Island ferry terminal to the hospital. The people, they moved away from me, she said, like I had the plague, like the germs were going to jump out and get them. She also talked about the Black nurses being sent to Seaview. At Seaview, Black nurses knew they could get hired, but at the other hospitals, they knew they would be put through the ringer, and the end line was that they weren't going to be hired. They came here in droves. It was a good opportunity for nurses down in the South to come here to have room and board. That's the way it was in TB time. 6. Kate Gillespie. Born in 1899 in Selma, Alabama, Kate was raised in the small town of Bessemer, 91 miles away from Montgomery. Her father, Thomas Anderson, an imposing and serious white man with striking blue eyes, he passed on to Kate, was 40 years older than her mother. His success as a farm worker and cattle owner allowed Kate and all her siblings to focus on one thing: school. After graduating from Hale Nursing School, she worked in Alabama for years, but in 1932 she took a job at Seaview to escape the South and its violence, her granddaughter said, and secure a better life for her 5-year-old son. Once her family asked her why she left, and she answered, "There was strange fruit growing on the trees." While at Seaview, Kate was in charge of the employee clinic, but in the mid-40s, she was promoted to a supervisory role and moved to the adult wards. According to her family, she was a lifelong activist for labor rights and advocated alongside A. Philip Randolph. Kate was one of the few nurses who didn't move to Staten Island. She loved Harlem and its culture, but mostly, Staten Island reminded her too much of the South that she wanted to leave behind. 7. Virginia Allen. There is so much to say about Miss Allen, as she's been with me from the outset of this journey, and her story opens my book. Recently, a spate of articles from the New York Times to the Campaign for Action have highlighted her life and contributions to nursing in great depth. But here's a small taste of Miss Allen, who at 92 is one of the last living Black angels. Born in 1931, she always wanted to be a nurse because she said, I would see my Aunt Edna in her nurse's whites, and I was inspired. In 1947, at a mere 16 years old, during a dire nursing shortage, Edna invited her to come to Seaview, where she was hired as a nurse's aide in the children's hospital. Some said it was the saddest place on earth, but Virginia remembers her time there fondly. Maybe because I was so young, she said. I found it a challenge, not a chore, but I also knew the children were very, very sick. Fortunately, she began working during the golden age of antibiotics, where more treatments were available for those sick with TB. In 1952, she, along with her colleagues, became part of a galvanizing movement in history, the isoniazid trials, which ushered in a cure for tuberculosis. Although the children were not a part of the trial, Miss Allen was privy to this long awaited moment. It was very exciting to see more patients going home. Following Seaview, she graduated from the School for Practical Nursing as an LPN and embarked on a long career in nursing. In addition, she became deeply involved in civil rights in her community. Now, retired from nursing, she remains an essential part of her Staten Island community, serving on various boards, championing women's issues, and continuing to advocate for education reform and youth development. She loves music, art, literature, theater, and traveling. She has always been guided by this principle. This world is all we have, and it is our duty to care for one another with love. So there you have it, a brief overview of the Black Angels, the Black nurses who were recruited from the South to help with the tuberculosis crisis in the early 20th century at Seaview Hospital in New York. Thank you so much for watching this video, everybody. I will leave some links in the description in the event you're interested in studying further about the Black Angels, who they were, who their families were, and more details about the contributions they made to medical science in the early 20th century. Thanks so much for watching this video, everybody. Until next time.